So good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Keegan Irwin. Today I'll be going over the Bloody Sunday Massacre on January 30, 1972, Northern Ireland. It's an informative speech on a famous riot for Speech 112, North Iowa Community College. So most of us are familiar to some extent with the Rodney King riots in 1992, the Cincinnati riots in 2001. Most of what Americans know about Bloody Sunday riots pretty much starts and ends with the song U2 wrote about it in 1983. So to bring some clarity to that event, we'll be going over the background, historical context, the events of that day, and then the aftermath and actions taken after the riot. So for the background, in 1921, a British treaty with Ireland broke the country into the northern states, which were Protestant dominated, and the southern states, which were Irish dominated. This led to sectarian violence in the north between Catholics and Protestants, which in 1968 spurred a British military deployment to Northern Ireland as a peacekeeping force. In 1971, on August 9 and 10, British troops were tasked to go house to house and arrest suspected IRA members from a list of 450. Martin Mayloff of Ulster University in 2010 noted that this was not the first time that internment protocol had been enacted in Northern Ireland, but it was the most strongly protested. In all, 342 suspected IRA members were interned without trial and without being charged with a crime. So the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association staged a protest against internment. James Campbell for Wayne State University wrote in 2013 that the march was diverted around military blockades, but that some of the protesters broke off and confronted military members behind the blockades, which was met with crowd control measures such as water cannons and CS gas. As the protests continued to escalate, higher military authorities ordered that British troops behind the blockades go through with reinforcements and arrest rioters directly in front of the blockades, but not to run down any fleeing protesters. This was completely ignored, and in running down the fleeing protesters, the British military ran over multiple civilians and injured them with military vehicles. Further down the protest's march route, some British soldiers were seen in the upper levels of a abandoned building. Civilians engaged them by throwing rocks but not hitting them. They fired the first shots of the day at the civilians and injured 2 of them. Elsewhere on the protest march route, some soldiers took cover behind a low wall, behind a barricade. Civilians threw rocks at the wall but didn't hit the soldiers. They fired into the crowd and killed 6 civilians. As the protest continued to escalate, protesters started fleeing into surrounding infrastructure, including a parking garage and apartment complexes. Soldiers followed them there and killed 7 more civilians within those areas. In all, the time lapse from reinforcements breaching the barricades to the last civilian being killed, which totaled 14, with 1 dying later. The time lapse was only 10 minutes. So for the aftermath, Owen Bocott of The Guardian wrote in 2010 that the most significant fallout from the Bloody Sunday Massacre was the uptick in IRA recruitment and violence against the British military in Northern Ireland. In 1972, on February 2nd, 3 days after the massacre, the British Parliament commissioned the Widgery Tribunal, which was meant to look into the events of that day, but was broadly criticized as being inaccurate and untruthful. Despite findings by the Derry City that the killings have been unjustified, Colonel Wilford, who was in charge of the soldiers responsible for that day, was given the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II later that year, and nothing was done in terms of discipline against any of the soldiers involved. In 1998, at the end of the Northern Ireland conflict, or the Troubles, Tony Blair commissioned the Savile Inquiry, which took from 1998 to 2004 and was published in 2010, finding that none of the killings that day were justified or justifiable. This spurred a murder inquiry against 19, a murder investigation against 19 British paratroopers starting in 2012, which is still ongoing. In conclusion, we went over the background and historical context of Bloody Sunday, the events of that day itself, and then the aftermath and actions taken to investigate and punish regarding those actions.